Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, episode 2, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I invite you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. I am Siseko Khumalo, your host, and as visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program, as well as a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. Today, my guest is Sarah Clunas, who is originally from Kingston, Jamaica. Sarah received her PhD in art history in 2006 from the University of Iowa. She is the Director of Academic Partnerships and Curator of the African Collection at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Before joining the Peabody in 2021, Clunas served as Director of the Xavier University Art Gallery, working as supervisor of the art collection team and assistant professor of art history at Xavier University of Louisiana for 7 years. Clunas has taught art history and curated for over 20 years at public universities and historically black colleges and universities. Her research, classes, and exhibitions have focused on the history of African art and the display of African objects in Western museum settings. She also studies the influence of African aesthetics and philosophy on the arts and religious rituals and cultural identities of the African diaspora. Her work examines gender, race, and migration in multiple contexts. She has published in both national and international magazines and journals. Clunas is committed to work that centers oral histories, indigenous scholarship, descendant communities, and the repatriation of cultural property. Sarah, welcome and thank you for joining me today on the Black Archive Visual Podcast. To begin, I'd love to think about your curatorial practice as the first of two impressive curators that I have on this particular show. And I'd just like to sort of, just to get a brief sense of what are the kinds of decisions that you're thinking about as you're engaging with the work. Of course, from your bio, we've already kind of heard some of the practices that that inform your curatorial practice, but I'd just love to hear a bit more in terms of, again, what are your decisions, what are your thoughts, and what are your ideas when you're approaching curating an exhibition?
Thank you so much for having me here, Siseko, today. There are so many different decisions, and I think even things that people don't even consider that I do as a curator to really understand not only the collections I work with, but even the exhibitions that I like to say I manifest into being.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand that I come from a post-colonial context, and I grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. My grandparents were, on my mother's side, on my maternal side, were very involved in the National Gallery of Art. My grandfather was a collector. He collected not only ephemera from pre-colonial Jamaica, maps, navigational items, things like that, but also art that was created by Jamaicans and also by itinerant artists that visited Jamaica. And so when, at a certain point, he gave his collection to the National Gallery, but I grew up around this collection that was all about tracing the history of Jamaicans. And my grandparents on my mother's side were Sephardic Jews that their ancestors had come to Jamaica in different waves, but the first set were running from the Spanish Inquisition in Spain. And so my grandfather was very cognizant of the fact that Jamaica was this multicultural space, but very much dominantly African. And so his collection really reflected that. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
My father was of predominantly African descent with some South Asian. His grandfather on his maternal side came from Chennai. It was then Madras, to work as an itinerant worker in the Caribbean after the emancipation of slavery. So I have this very rich history, this rich cultural history that informs me. But growing up in Jamaica, one of the things that I'd like to stress to people from the continent is that Africa is very much there.
Yeah.
And a part of our post-colonial, I think, move out of colonialism and out of this sort of post-slavery society was to really bring back everything we could find about Africa. It was really about mining, like what our memories were, what our culture gave us, what our history was and is, and I think that has very much informed who I am. So, when I walk into a gallery that I'm about to curate, there's a very different action than when I walk into collection storage.
Okay.
When I walk into a gallery that I'm about to curate, I look for the womb of the space. And the womb of the space to me is a transference of the core of who I am, but also the core of the energy of the artwork or the objects. There's usually an object or a point from which everything radiates.
Okay.
And I think of it as energetic, but it could also just make sense on a very critical theory level as well. For instance, I did an exhibition called Queen at Xavier Art Gallery, where I worked with works from the collection of CCH Pounder. And it was all about representations of Black women throughout the diaspora, as well as had many African artists, contemporary African artists as well. But it also looked at even artists that weren't of African descent, how they represented Blackness, particularly in terms of women. What was the center of that show, what was the womb of that show, was a painting by Harmonio Rosales, who's a Cuban-American artist, called The Birth of Oshun, which very much, I would say, was a riff on The Birth of Venus, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, but instead emerging from the water is Oshun. She's got vitiligo, but it's in gold throughout her body. And you have the other African Orishas, Yumayas, waiting for her on the shore with this beautiful peacock feathers. And what I really chose that as the womb of the show because it was about beauty. Oshun, a Yoruba goddess, is about beauty. But it also riffed on this sort of iconic Botticelli's Venus, which was really saying something about art history and beauty and aesthetics in the Italian Renaissance. But I also chose it because I feel like Botticelli's Venus really was in very many ways a message to women throughout history of this kind of ideal feminine form. And here, Harmonio Rosales was replacing this feminine form with this beautiful Black woman that had this vitiligo, that really was, she didn't have flowing hair, her hair was closely cropped, but it was really about understanding one's place in history and sort of being like, there's a space for me here too. I also have histories, cosmologies, mythologies, you know, I also have beauty. And that became this essence that radiated throughout the exhibition. And because it was there, interestingly enough, I had people from the community call me and say, we'd like to do a little shrine for Oshun in the gallery. We'd like to play drums at the opening. And I said, come. Everybody come. Right? And so that opening became not just, you know, sipping wine and looking at paintings very politely. Instead, we had a Babalocha come, built a very tiny shrine for Oshun in the corner of the gallery, but beautiful, like pumpkins and daisies and a cake and everything, you know. And his community came because he was there, right? And he, with his consecrated drums, he had been consecrated in Cuba, but was from a descendant community in Louisiana, descended from enslaved people in Louisiana. His whole entire community came, and they drummed, and wouldn't you know it, everybody started dancing. And as we say in Jamaica, catching the spirit, you know, and there was a lot of movement in the gallery, and it flowed throughout the gallery. And people who didn't want to still were there enjoying it, and people who did want to was there. Some people started like singing some chants and things like that. All of them very concretely grounded in Lukumi or Ifa or Yoruba tradition. I didn't plan that. I didn't orchestrate that, right? That was because I helped to make a vessel for that energy to happen, right? I felt that what my job was to create a holding environment, and that this exhibition was going to be about healing.
For sure.
Because I had many students. It's at HBCU, Xavier, historically black college. About 95% of my students are African descent. And interestingly enough, about 90% of them are female, which of course brings to our minds, like, where are the black men of this age range in the United States? Do you know what I mean?
And that's a deeper and more broader conversation that has more political implications than we would like to think.
100%.
Right.
But it is part of the subtext of the exhibition, right? It was something that I would constantly bring up and say, these are for my female students. This exhibition was really came from them and their questions, because I had in class talked about Mende culture and how Mende women and how Mende culture in general really appreciate and idealize black skin and very dark black skin. You know, to be ideal is to have a very, very dark color, and then also to accentuate that color with like shea butter or oils, and so then one becomes shiny and black, right? And this is like the ideal. Well, my students, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe it. They came up to me after class, and many of them are raised in the South, but even, you know, from all over the United States, even internationally, would say to me, I've never heard that before. I've always felt like less beautiful because my lighter skinned sister was always thought to be more beautiful, or my mother is lighter skinned and people always said, oh, you should look more like her, or my cousin. And
so the melanin has always been sort of like discarded, and they haven't experienced this kind of focusing in on the celebration of this beautiful melanin.
It's been the proximity to whiteness, you know, which I think is not just true for the United States. I think it's true for the diaspora. I think it's true for Africa. I think it's true, and it's part of the post-colonial mindset, right? So when I was teaching this, my students just loved it. They just ate it up. It just gave them so much healing and love and attention and talking about like the beauty, and you could see that, you know, people were going to go home and going to see themselves in a different way. And that's really what made me excited about doing the exhibition. My exhibition came from the community. It came from what the community needed for healing. And I went to CCH Pounder, who is an actress and a collector and an entrepreneur, and I said, you have this collection. This came up in my class. Let's do an exhibition. And we worked together to do an exhibition together. And at first I was like, I only want to include images of dark-skinned women. You know, it's so crazy because I was like, I really need there to be this celebration. And Cece was like, no, all African women, because, you know, light-skinned women experience their own issues of isolation. And so she supported that, you know, and it ended up being, you know, now it's traveling. It's going to I believe the DeSalle Museum in Chicago. I may be saying that name wrong, but anyway, it's going to a museum in Chicago. So it has been traveling around. But the point is that that exhibition came from a community idea, what the community needed. And I then saw myself as the mediator of healing for the community. And I did the work that needed to be done. I also saw what was the womb of the exhibition. It made itself present to me. And then that community, that spiritual community came to me as well. And they did their thing and their healing work in that space. And I really only kind of sort of mediated, you know? It really wasn't, I wasn't the author of it, as Foucault would say. You know, like, I didn't author it at all. Like, I just sort of created the holding environment.
And this kind of, it brings me, it segues quite nicely to the broader themes that we're considering. For example, in this series of conversations where we're talking about the Black Archive, and in my work I've defined the Black Archive, you know, as the music, poetry, literature, and artworks of Black folk who continued to theorize about Blackness, even as Blackness was excluded from sites of formal knowledge production. And what you've just shared with us is precisely the ways in which that Black Archive becomes alive, right? So it becomes as you say, it's knowledge that exists within the communities. It's knowledge that is co-created, not intentionally. It's never, oh, this is the idea. This is what we're going to do. You know, we're going to collaborate with community partners in this way. It kind of just, it ebbs and flows and kind of creates its own. It's a self-directing energy. It's a self-directing project because, to a large extent, it kind of sort of takes seriously this idea that within our communities, within our local spaces, knowledge does exist. It doesn't only exist in the hallowed halls of the museums or the universities or, you know, the departments that produce all of this scientific knowledge. Knowledge has always existed in Black communities. And this kind of takes me to, you know, a subsidiary question that I have around, for example, your scholarship. So to an extent, you've kind of already weaved to us the ways in which community-based knowledge and practices feeds into response to, and in a certain way actually even challenges, right, the authority of these scientific, high-walled institutions, right? And I'm curious about the ways in which your scholarship sort of weaves between those spaces, because there is legitimacy within both, right? But what we've always done is that we've kind of taken this idea that legitimacy only emanates from these grand institutions, right? These grand spaces of science, these grand spaces that have been sort of sanctified in some way or the other as a university, as a museum. But what you're demonstrating is how your practice weaves between those spaces to say, let's find legitimacy within both of these spaces. Let's co-create knowledge within both of these spaces. And I'm curious about how your scholarship sort of borrows from your curatorial practice in terms of holding the realities of doing that work, because I'm certain there are many, many people who will resist you, who will say, no, we're the professors, we're the folks who hold the PhDs, we're the people with the quote unquote legitimate knowledge, and that legitimate knowledge resides and exists within the university. And when you begin to open that space up, you know, people feel vulnerable because they don't know how to handle locally based knowledges. They don't know how to handle knowledges that are coming from communities and that don't necessarily look or reflect the kinds of systems of legitimation that we have to go through in the university. So how do you approach that sort of tightrope walking project of balancing between, you know, again, the powers of, you know, the academy and the powerful knowledge that resides within our communities? How do you balance that in your scholarship? I know that's a big question.
Oh my gosh, it's such a big question. But I think first of all, it depends on the community, right? What certain communities don't really acknowledge in many ways, like I would say the New Orleans community, the Southern community, and communities that are predominantly of African descent have created their own grand spaces. And in those communities, like the community that I came from, which was vehemently rejecting colonialism, right? I was born 73, right? So in the midst of Bob Marley, in the, you know, born into Garveyism, Pan-Africanism, Césaire, you know, this is the mindset. So my idea of a grand space was really actually the grand spaces of Africa that were taught to me about the history of the African continent. So I had a concept of Africa as an intellectual space.
Yeah.
I had a concept of Africa and the diaspora as a space of inquiry. And I grew up with that concept. So I was lucky in that way, in the sense that it wasn't that I was, in many ways, it wasn't that I didn't see the colonial energy. It wasn't that I didn't even like incorporate the colonial energy into my very being, because British colonial imperialism, if you will, was very, very strong in Jamaica. And my parents grew up under it. So my father my grandmother on my father's side was one of the first wave of Caribbean immigrants to England. My father spoke with a British accent. He was very proper and
mannered.
Very mannered. Everything was knife and fork. You know, everything was perfect. Everything had to be perfect for him. And my mom was sort of grew up with all of this. You know, she was white in this colonial space, and yet was trying to figure out a way in which she could sort of fit within the space, right? So I could see them coming together. It made sense in a way. So in some ways, because of that, I was kind of born into the straddling, right? Often having to move back and forth between spaces.
Yeah.
My father's family was a different kind of family environment than my mother's family environment. And I was always going back and forth between both. But I will say that what, for me, how I straddle the space is I think I often will champion community space more than any space that seems to me to be overseer space. I kind of consider it overseer space. Like, and I try to act in ways, because even in, African communities that have one leader or one seat, right? Like Yoruba, Ashanti, like the Benin Kingdom. Even if you look at communities like this, you will see that it's not simply just a head of state. There's always like a community, a judicial community that informs things. But Jamaican community is really interesting because we're really predominantly Igbo and Akan, which is like an interesting mix. Both very, very rejecting of power dynamics, right? Akan in the sense that, there's a certain kind of order to things and everybody has a certain kind of space and there's a certain kind of structure. Igbo, because Igbo are egalitarian, although of course they have their strict spaces too, but at the same time, very rejecting of any kind of power structure, right? Because everything should be decided by everybody. Everybody needs to get an opinion, right? So when a power structure comes into that space, it's very rejecting. So these things are things that inform who I am, and my knowledge of African history is deep, and part of it is deep because I'm searching for myself, my African self, because my Jewish ancestors can trace themselves all the way back, and they've done it sort of because that's their tradition to do it. And it's not that my African ancestors didn't do that as well. It's just the rupture of the transatlantic slave trade, the violence of the separation of traditions and cultures, left the majority of Jamaicans in a space in which they were severely abused. Jamaica was a plantation machine. It was 813 plantations. And it didn't really exist in the colonial mind, or the slave trade mind for any other reason than for profit in that particular way. So with the emancipation of slavery, what you got was a large amount of people who were psychologically wounded by their experience. And I think of it sometimes like people who grow up in abusive households, right? So what we are dealing with in the Caribbean, and I think I would say in the United States and in many diaspora communities, is the recovery, the healing from that rupture. And the only way to heal is through the stories. And the only way to heal is through the oral histories. And the only way to heal is to archive the information and to mine the archives so that the information can be taught in the classrooms and the stories can be told to the children.
But I'm interested about that, or I'm interested in that claim, Sarah, because I'm negotiating that tension, right? And I call it a tension because, for example, part of the work that I do focuses quite largely indeed on the oral histories, right? Orature, oracy, orality, and its place in the knowledge-making enterprise. Christopher Miller, there's that amazing book that's come up and continues to come up on this platform quite a bit, Theories of Africans, which he published in 1991, focusing on Francophone literary traditions on the continent, kind of makes a very poignant and useful point. He says that the moment we write orality down, we calcify it, we kill it. It becomes, because orature by its very nature is nimble, it moves, it is, and I've seen this a number of times. So I've written a couple of pieces that are thinking through the kinds of conceptual moves that happen when an orator takes the stage, for example, and is giving a particular account of a story. In the Zulu kingdom, this is a really, it's an amazing thing to watch, because a whole host of stuff happens in that moment of the orator, sort of giving us a historical account, giving us contemporary critique. Institutions of power that are beyond the pale of critique come into critique when the orator takes the stage, right? Like society negotiates things that we would otherwise say, oh, that's a settled thing, that's tradition, that's custom. Those conceptual moves kind of fall away when the orator takes the stage, because the orator has every capacity to challenge, and it's interesting that we're having this conversation just after, last week's conversation, which was a conversation with Ni Aikwe Parks, and we were talking exactly about this, right? We were talking about what is the function of oracy and orality. So, to get back to the comment in terms of where you piqued my interest, and maybe this is a place where we can then begin to share how we negotiate these tensions. How do we relay? Because as I say, I think the point that I was trying to make by referring to my writing is that when I try to communicate this in written form, when I try to put it down in a methodological kind of way, it comes out feeling rather ewy and weird, and because I to a reader who has never been witness to storytelling methods, for example, as we see them playing out, as they are narrated by Xhosa women, for example, in the outbacks of Transkei, what was then known as the Transkei or Ciskei, what is now called the Eastern Cape in South Africa, or as we see, what we call Inyosi, right, the poets, what would be an equivalent of the Scottish bard, right, on the other tradition, what they do, I can never quite communicate it. And I know what it is. I see it. I've grown up in these traditions. I know it. And I love it, because folks who say, for example, these are patriarchal societies, when you go to that moment of storytelling, history narration through orature, those categories collapse. It's impossible for us to say, oh, that's what the society is, and as a result, it's undemocratic, or it's this or that or the other thing, because in those spaces, in those moments, they are. And as a result of that kind of revision, or those kinds of outbursts, or those ruptures, as facilitated by this public poet, or this person who's sort of, or sort of orally recounting our histories, there are moments where institutions are susceptible to social revision, right? So those moments sort of come up. So I guess in a very roundabout way, I'm sitting with the beauty, the complexity, the incredible realities that exist in these oral histories and these oral traditions. And I'm navigating that against the fact that they refuse, sometimes because they are worlds of secrets, they refuse to be, the secrets to be revealed, and they refused to sort of be pinned down by the written word. So how does one negotiate this work of excavation? Excavation for the purposes of teaching other generations to be like, these are the traditions that you come from. This is the wealth of knowledge that these traditions possess, without calcifying them, without petrifying them into a death that we have been warned about by so many orators around the globe, right? From every single tradition, who say, we do not want this written because writing it sort of, as I say, calcifies it, petrifies it, kills it. So how does one do that work of teaching, especially in the university space, where the university space will say, where's the written work? Where's the paper? Where's the book chapter? Where's the book that discusses this kind of stuff? And you're like, I get that, but when I codify the stuff in that way, writing it, it becomes completely and utterly different. So how does one respond? How would you respond to that as an individual who's sort of working with these kinds of knowledges?
So I think there are a couple of different things I want to respond to. One is that if you can see things in many different ways, and I think that if you take, for instance, I just taught a class on the Benin bronzes, a seminar, and we used, majority of the literature that we used was from Nigerian historians and theorists and critics. And we also used art historians, global art historians, philosophers, things like that as well. And many of the oral histories written down were very different. They were telling the same story, but there was a different king, a different Oba that was more special, or this Oba was specifically from Ile Ife, or actually the Oba's father or some relative was actually from the Ogise. Like, it was like everybody's oral history had a way of championing them, right? And their story. And it was political to give the opposing stories.
Yes.
But without the written, I can't have my students at all engage with the material, right? And I think that
because they don't know the language,
because
they don't have access
know
to
the language and they don't have access, and I don't know. I'm not at the point where I can fly oral historians and griots in to relay the information. But I would say that in my mind, I do not dichotomize things, right? Like I don't say it's written or it's oral. The Yoruba say what comes after 6 is more than 7.
Yes.
My concept of incorporating the African philosophical tradition, and I'm moving primarily from West and Central, is that I think of things as multiple and dispersed and myriad. So by writing down oral history, you could say you're killing it, but are you really killing it? Is that giving it too much power, right? Is your writing down giving it too much power? There are multiple oral histories about Sunjata.
Yes.
Multiple. I've read all of them, or not all of them, sorry, but most of them that I can get my hands on, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in reading different oral histories. And at the same time, I've also heard oral histories being told to me by people. What I will say is this. So if you are writing it down and you are killing it, what does that killing mean? What does it mean to kill something? Is it like Igbo? Is it like sacrifice? Is it like I'm sacrificing something so this can be more? Because that's part of traditional African practice as well, right? That to release in what Yoruba call ashe, right? That there needs to be a certain sacrifice that happens, right? So if we are to release the ashe of the story, maybe what we are here to do is to sacrifice a certain amount so that the ashe becomes another thing. I mean, are you trying to write a sunset into being? Are you trying to write the waves lapping on the shore? Are you trying to write the smell of your mother's cooking? Like, you can't write those things.
Yes.
Those things have to be experienced, experiential.
Yeah.
And that's where curating comes in. But it's not just an object. Because for me, in the Caribbean and my experiences on the continent, traditional African art has always been about movement and music
Yes.
and spirit.
Yes.
And it's not about just the object in a case.
Yeah.
Or the object
It's not
on a
static.
wall. It's not static. And therefore, I would not see the next step of writing as being something static. We come from a tradition that will not allow that to happen. We should not fear, right? This is part of making this information accessible. And frankly, African traditions, great African kingdoms wrote things down. I mean, this idea that like, you know, the I'm speaking specifically of the West right now, but like Sangre, Ghana, Mali, there are written documents from these areas, you know, in Arabic in particular, but like this idea that writing didn't happen is not true. Plus there are ideogram systems as well, right? There are ways in which the Congo cosmogram is facilitated, or different kinds of ideograms are drawn on the floors of shrines or altars or near graves to communicate specific messages to the spirits and the ancestors. You see this in the Veves in Haiti. You see this in the Pontos Riscados in Brazil. These are ways in which we speak to our ancestors, or the living speak to the ancestors. Frankly, I think that's whoa, right? Like that's writing too, right? And instead of killing, you're actually bringing into being energy, right? It gives us like,
It opens particular channels to spaces that we would otherwise not have access to if we didn't do that work of communing with the spirit world
and
in
we're
that
always
way.
doing that work. Even if we're not conscious doing it, ancestrally, we are made to do it. We are, this is our purpose here. And I really honestly think that, you know, this idea of writing is just another part of what we bring to this communication, this broader communication. And I like the idea that Christopher Miller talks about it as a killing, because I can take that and go with that.
You can do so much with that concept.
I can do so much with that concept. I can say in the killing of it, really, I'm opening up all kinds of other connections, right? Across Kalunga lines or, you know, borders, crossroads, however you want to see it. We are not, I think, by nature modernists. I don't think by nature we are. I don't think we gender things, and I'm talking about sort of coming out of the African tradition. We gender things, but we leave all kinds of room for there
for other stuff and other categories
within those categories, right? Like, you know, to represent the Ioba, the Queen Mother represented in the Benin Kingdom, she has to be dressed and adorned like a man, right? Most masquerades.
But even that demonstrates this really cool idea, which I think exists even within orature, oracy, and orality, of androgyny, right? So playing between these two spaces, which itself, androgyny, gives us this fundamental sort of point that is consistently and constantly celebrated across African communities, whether it be on the continent or within the diaspora, of creation, right? So androgyny becomes the space of creation because of its ambiguity, right? It becomes this place of birth. But I'm interested in this amazing objection that you're putting to this notion of the calcification, killing, and sort of this ossification of orature through the written word. And the point that you brought up of the fact that you're reading so many accounts and so many different accounts. And part of, you know, what I have come to sort of understand about specifically the way that names work in Nguni custom is that we're all talking about the same story, right? We're all telling exactly the same story, but different characters play different roles in different settings, right? So for example, you will have particular names appropriated in, some names expunged or erased out. And for me, and I see this the most, for example, when the king Uzwelithini transitioned. I believe it was in 2021. I forget now. I think it was 2021. When the king, and this was by far the longest serving monarch of the Zulu nation, great figure, revered figure, respected figure, and sometimes in certain circles, a feared figure. So when the king transitions, there's a moment within the Zulu nation of contesting, writing, and it crystallized, the different accounts crystallized for me the political act of the orator in certain embellishments, certain deletions, focusing on certain aspects. That's where you see politics playing itself out, right? In the public domain. It's in the contestations. It's in the, yes, we hear that, but,
Yes.
and this is happening in community, right? It's not an individual who claims to be the authoritative figure, who claims to be the one sole person who has the story to tell. So you see, for example, within like a day or two of the king's transitioning and the news hitting, various media platform, we begin to see a revisitation of his names from various, and this was musicians, like people within a day or two, musicians
Well, I was going to
coming
say
out.
music. This is all about music.
Right?
Okay,
right?
I'll address that after you finish talking, yeah.
So different musicians come out with like different renditions, different takes. Some are considering the question of succession, who will succeed the king, and when we do have a clear successor as well, uMisuzulu kaZwelithini, who is the current king sitting on the throne at the moment, there's still an interesting contestation, even today, right? Through the music, through the poetry, through the names, because he hasn't yet quite, because he's so new,
He's not shown himself.
and he hasn't gotten a grip on the story, right? And poets are still taking advantage of the room that is afforded to all of us by this great moment of King Zwelithini transitioning, right? Like it's such a, and so I suppose the my response to the objection of writing is that, and I guess one can do this in a number of ways, right? So in a written account, one can contest a written account by publishing another. As you have said,
Right.
what you and your students do is that you read various accounts of one particular story, and different people are chiming in from different perspectives. And I think for me, what is exciting about orature, what is exciting about oracy, and also the different genres, right? So Mazisi Gunene, for example, does a fantastic outlining of at least 5 genres in Zulu literature that we find, right? Poetry, history, the allegorical story, the fantasy, and the poem, right? The epic poem, right?
Yeah.
So we've got these 5 categories, and he traces the ways in which even the hearer of whatever is being recited, the kinds of characteristic qualities that one needs to know in order to be able to classify, okay, that, for example, is not a historical account. Inzumanzumane, it's a fantastical story telling that draws from these other genres, by the way, right? Or that is not an allegory, that is a historical, factual tracing
Right.
that gives us a sort of historical that brings us to the contemporary day, right? And I guess that's the exciting thing for me about as I say, orature is that we see politics playing out in very, very real ways, in real time. Because often people will say, "Oh, democracy is dead. We don't get to participate in this thing anymore." And I think when we turn to a non-Western, non-Enlightenment tradition, right, which is constantly sort of invested in this tradition of orature, we see contemporary ways in which maybe even principles of democracy can be sort of enlivened again, thinking about the ways in which these contestations play themselves out, right? I don't know if you
Absolutely. I'm dying to jump in.
please.
It's multiplicity, right? And it has to do, when you're talking, all I could think about was music. Even before you said the musicians, I thought, well, this is just music, right? This is just what I call black music, right? Like, which is this, obviously generates from the African continent, but is all about this syncopated rhythm, and you see the syncopation happening within the oral histories and the multiplicities of the oral histories. And the idea is that I can start with a drum, and you can start to pick up a conversation that I'm having with a drum with your saxophone, and you can respond to the drum with the saxophone, and then someone else can come in. It's improv. It's not an orchestra. There's a difference, right? And they can exist together.
Yes.
They can.
Yes.
But they're different languages,
Yes.
right? And so you can write and attempt to write, but like I said, you will never, ever...
Fully.
And you shouldn't try. There isn't really any benefit in trying. Like,
And
you
that-
can record within the limitations, within the parameters of that art form. Writing itself is an art form.
Now, would you say maybe that the attempt to try to capture is the true killing, right? So aside
Yeah,
from the
maybe.
ritual, the ritualistic killing that facilitates a birth of something new, the ossification, the calcification happens when a writer attempts to write the grand narrative, because there can never be a grand narrative.
Well, that's a... let's go back to the original question.
Yeah.
That, for me, feels like a Western concept.
Aha.
The grand narrative. And so, going back to your original question of how do I balance, this concept of how I'm living within this Western, I want to say Carolingian liberal arts, university structure, and also engaging with the knowledge systems that I engage with West and Central Africa. I would say that I often am more immersed in the knowledge systems and less immersed in the university, although I occupy, my site is the university. I think the only reason I am in a place like the place I am now is because this place is ready for me. 5 years ago, maybe not so much. You know what I'm saying? I am here because the place is ready for me. And so I don't try to capture it's like, say you have this box overflowing with jewels and gold and like diamonds and sparkly things, and then you try to shove it in like this like little tiny cardboard box or whatever. It's not going to happen. That to me is what happens with writing. Like, I have to allow my writing to kind of go in different directions. So, for instance, the most recent paper I wrote was journal article I wrote was looking at. It was for the Journal for Women, Gender and Family of Colors, or gender, something like that. And it was about the unexpected Caribbean. That was the theme. And what I talked about was this artist called Ebony Patterson. I don't know if you know her work, but she looks at dance hall, specifically men in the dance hall sphere. So like the sessions where men and women and people get together and dance, but it comes out of this 9-night, this funerary tradition, right? And so what I looked at with her work was she started making, after her father died, she started making, all the work was tapestries and materials and cloth. So I looked at how cloth was perceived by enslaved Africans in Jamaica, and tied it to festivals that were very similar to Egungun festivals in Yoruba. And so the paper was like, when I first started, my editors were like, oh my gosh, there's like a lot going on here, and I had to condense it, which meant really probably taking about 25 pages out that I thought was necessary, but was just too much. And still, it's like a little piece of what I know to be true, what I see, right? What I saw all my life growing up was these Egungun, elements of Egungun, right? In the Jonkunu masquerades and things like that. I could see it. As soon as I learned of Egungun, I understood immediately where these elements were coming from. And
sure.
yeah. And then I saw this contemporary artist start working on paper, and then all of a sudden, after the passing of her father, starting working with material and cloth, which is, of course, very much tied to lineage ancestors, right? So that's what I incorporated into my piece to talk about her work. It's not, I think, the way that she thinks about her work, you know, because I've had conversations with her, like just asking, do you ever see this relationship? But from my perspective of it, and sort of the way in which I've traveled or traversed throughout the world, I see these elements in her work. I cannot condense it to a paper. You will never, ever see what I see through my writing. You will get a little bit of it, and someone will take that and go
somewhere do whatever they're doing
else with it. But
yeah.
what I did with it was I did it. I did the work that I need to do, and I let it go. And it's not so much about the Igbo or the sacrifice that happens with the writing that kills the tradition or the oral history, or even just my own perception of the way that I see things. You know, Africa in the Caribbean. But it is when one makes Igbo, when one makes sacrifice, one releases ashe. You're not creating necessarily something new. You're allowing a line of communication between the living and those that came before. However you want to perceive that. It could be Foucault who came before you, right? Like, in other words, like, if you get what I'm saying? Like, I'm using this concept of the crossroads and Igbo and sacrifice as a way, because you brought up the killing, writing is killing, as a way of transmutation, if you will, as a way of communicating this idea into the world at large. And you don't know how it's going to be taken or how it's going to be grasped. When you make Igbo and ancestors come or spirits come, and there are conversations between the living and the ancestors, the past and the present is how I like to think about it. When the conversations between the past and the present, you don't know how that's going to go. You have to just let it go. That's why what comes after 6 is more than 7. You cannot say for sure it's 7, and that's it, and it ends there.
And because it doesn't.
Because it doesn't end there.
It doesn't.
And the Western tradition wants us to produce this 7 and say,
that's it.
7. You know, one of my dissertation advisors said to me, you can't talk about this because these people are still alive. You know, because I want to talk about contemporary Caribbean art practice that really, you could see Africa within the contemporary Caribbean art practice. And he said, these artists are still alive. These things you can't make a full, like, a dissertation is not complete unless you choose someone who has passed, and then you can make a full sort of like reading of that artists. And I completely rejected that. Every single part of me rejected that. I didn't do what he said. I didn't do what he said, because I said, okay, maybe you're not the right person
to advise me on this,
because I'm about improv. I'm about holding environments. I'm about spaces that are multiple spaces. I'm about really non-binary things in general, right? And I think that writing is part of one of those non-binary things. The West would like us to feel that it's the thing. It gets us tenure. It gets us, it's the ticket to ride. Right? You're writing. But writing is just one aspect of that.
So much more.
Of so much more.
Of so much more.
Of so much more. And it doesn't go against the traditional African way, because writing has always existed in Africa in a variety of forms, in a more expansive way, I would say.
And this is one of the reasons why, for example, you know, I love Mazisi Kunene's work so much, because he demonstrates to us exactly the point that you've just made, to say it doesn't exist in this one thing, right? And what often happens is that folks will read our traditions without the awareness of the complexity and the multiplicity that defines our traditions, and then say, oh, these are lacking because they haven't been quote unquote systematized, they haven't been, and as I say, some of these traditions refuse that. They refuse to be systematized because it's exactly this idea that they're open-ended. They continue to draw from, and we see it to this very day. You know, I look across the continent, and I think about the ways in which music is defining how young people are interacting and shaping their realities in Africa today. Music is this place where folks, as you're saying, are improvising. They're thinking about, and in that they're creating culture, right? It's not as if they're creating this thing that sits outside of culture, that, you know, that sits outside the pale of analysis or the pale of reason. They're reasoning, they're theorizing as they're doing this work, right? But I want to take us back to, and this is,
it's also like, I just want to comment, it's like you can't, I'm going to go back to this music analogy too, like it's, you know, Coltrane is different than Mahler. Like, it's not the same thing at all, right?
And it's good that it's not the same.
No, it's great that it's not the same. I listen to both of them, you know, one after the other, just so I can...
Because they give us different things.
They give us different things.
And those different things are rich in and of themselves and are good in and of themselves. So and that's, I think, one of the things that folks, especially in the academy, tend to be afraid of. Because you remember the first question that we were like dealing with, which is to say, folks in the academy are afraid of what they don't know. Because the idea is that once you've gotten the professorship, once you've been minted with the doctoral degree, you're a knower, right? And so when you come up against stuff that you don't know, when you come up against traditions that you don't know, I laughed, in last week's episode, Nee was just talking about the fact that, when a lot of folks, he's a writer, and so when a lot of folks say to him, we have the masters, and he's like, okay, fine, that's great, that's good. But think about, for example, the masters that we have in our traditions, and he says that a lot of folks tend to shut up. His white counterparts and colleagues tend to be sort of muted when he begins to draw from another tradition because they don't know those traditions. All that they've ever studied, all that they know is what they've paid attention to, what they've valorized, and what they've valorized are their own masters. And I think what the conversation just demonstrates to me is the ambidexterity of African intellectuals or African descended intellectuals, specifically when it comes to the ways in which we read and how we read, because we are reading across traditions. We don't have sort of one tradition that we're like, oh, this is it, this is the end, it's constantly having to understand that when I go to my African literary greats, I'm getting something different, for example, than what I'm getting from when I'm going to the English literary greats, the Russian literary greats, the American literary greats. And I'm reading each and every single one of them, not judging them against each other, but appreciating the kinds of lessons that each are teaching me. Which brings me to the next part of our conversation, which is to say that it's a recent thing, the directorship at the Peabody. I think it's 2021 it's like yesterday.
Just like yesterday.
You know what I mean? So, and that's a very interesting institution, by the way.
Yes, it's very interesting.
That's a very interesting institution. But I'd love to know about your... You're dealing with the African collection in the Peabody.
Curator of the African collection, yeah.
And you've just mentioned that, you taught on the Benin bronzes with your students, gave a seminar.
I taught a BU seminar on it, yeah.
And that's a contentious topic.
Yeah.
That's a very, very contentious topic because for a number of reasons.
Absolutely.
The first, and I think the most...
Contentious topics are interesting.
Right.
And they inspire curiosity and they inspire critical thinking. Non-contentious topics tend to be easy, and I'm not really here for easy. Go ahead.
It's contentious because the primary reason in any case is that a lot of us are looking at sacred items in our cultures that are today sitting in museum spaces as parts of collections. And you'll know this, Sarah, because you have access to that world. Certain items play certain functions in terms of the metaphysics and cosmologies of the peoples all across the continent. And so I'm negotiating, in a way, also trying to be politically correct, how we deal with that, right? Because we've heard calls for repatriation of these items. Folks call us reductionist when we do that kind of work. Folks call us essentialist when we do that kind of work. And all those, of course, are moves that seek to attack the people who are saying, but these items need to be repatriated. I've been having some very, very interesting conversations while I'm here at Harvard. And some folks are like, it's not the idea. And of course, yes, we get it. These items are invaluable. We cannot estimate their value because, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not, for example, the looter's point to tell us that these items are. So the point that I'm just getting at is to think about how you negotiate those kinds of tensions, taking into consideration your own identity. As you say, you grow up, your grandfather's got these incredible collections that he hands over to
the National Gallery.
Yeah. So there's also that sense of, from what I understood in any case from your introductory remarks, was that there's that sense of piecing together within the family, right? Within your very self, there's this
classifying, systemizing, collecting, gifting, holding as an archive in the gallery, the history of the nation.
Right?
Yeah.
But even before we get to the whole gifting part, there's an ontological move of self-constitution in the collection. Right? So the collection is not just, oh, this is a nice item, I want it. It serves a function, right?
Yeah.
In as much as, for example, the collections that we have in the Peabody, the African collection, served particular functions to particular communities at particular points in time. And that function was its ways of knowing, self-knowing.
Absolutely. They're archives.
Right? So thinking about that history of self-constitution, and I think it places you in an incredible position, right, to manage and to deal with these items, because you know what these items are. It's not just a number that, is insured for X amount and that we can haul out of storage one day to exhibit. There's a certain care that you take because you know what these items mean. You know the place and function that they serve as part and parcel of an ontology of people, which was attemptingly, or which folks attempted to decimate and to erase and to kill, right? So thinking about that, and I know this is a mouthful, but thinking about that, could you say a bit more about how you came into the role and how you're navigating the role?
Sure. So I think that my PhD work is really focusing on traditional African art forms. But when I was doing my work, I really I felt at that point, I was in my mid-20s, I felt that I had lived in Ghana for a while, I had traveled throughout West Africa, and I felt like there was no way for me to go there and not be almost like a colonial objectifying, gaze to do the research there. Even though I identify as Black, I identify as from African descent, I come from a predominantly Black place, me and the physiognomy that I am, but also Americans in general, regardless, whether Black Americans or in West Africa are, in Ghana, you're a Bruni or foreigner, there's a approximation to whiteness. And I wasn't ready. I hadn't sort of established in my mind this way of being able to go there and not othering. And I didn't want to do it because I felt that way myself. I felt that I had been othered when I came here to school and anywhere that I had ever been in the world. And so I decided that I wanted to focus on what I consider to be like my people, but the Caribbean, where I would be able to go there and really sort of do this kind of like participant observer thing.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that really created my trajectory in which I was often dealing with descendant communities, often dealing with diaspora issues, but seeing within the diaspora Africa and sort of being like, see, it is here too. See, it is also here. My mentors were very much like, this is not what we do. We go to Africa. We do field work. We write things down. We study
ethnography.
It was this coming right out of ethnography, even though it was art history, because African art history is still relatively maybe about a century old before it was ethnography, right? So my work at Xavier was the culmination of this work with descendant communities, where I was constantly working with students, constantly working. Xavier's really located in the city, so it's really an urban campus. We worked with people in neighborhoods, where I worked in an art village with they'd have like pottery days, and we had a community garden. But the gallery, which was really something that I helped to sort of create in a way, the gallery that I became director of, was really about exhibiting work that was either already in the area by collectors or generated in the area, and then bringing in the community to have a relationship with the objects. At the same time, I was still supervising the art collection, which was a team, and they had traditional African objects. So I also put traditional African objects throughout the campus in cases, and so that everywhere that people went, they would see their history, right? That their history didn't start with slavery. Their history
Predates.
way predates so much, right? And they would have connections to that history. Now, the part of what brought me here, I believe, was the Peabody's desire to work primarily. The role of the curator was to be a curator that does a lot of work with descendant communities. So it's not just about working with the objects, but actually working with communities. And I think that they saw that in me, the work, that I also had the knowledge that I needed to be a curator of a collection like this, but that I was constantly working with descendant communities, and they wanted that in the role. I would say that my role as a curator is different than the one that I imagined when I came into this field.
Okay.
I really honestly felt that, in the 90s, when I was first deciding to do this work, I really thought I would really be hanging things on walls and, doing like database stuff with, classifying, more classification stuff. Still like classifying, still also like not classifying. It's like, again, it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah.
Classification is fun. Just throwing a wrench in classification is also fun. You know what I mean? It's like making something and destroying it too. I mean, that has a kind of healing component as well, right? Or just parsing through or tearing things apart. You have to be eager to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of work I do at the Peabody. It's about not only caring for the collection that's there, but also connecting that collection to the people that it really deeply matters to. And also knowing that you talked about this idea of us as knowers. You can only really be a really, really, I think, efficient knower if you are an incredibly curious person, and if you can't get the kind of information that you need if you're a know-it-all. So I tend to go into spaces like, tell me about this, what is this, what is this, what is that? I never come like, I am the expert on this, right? I want to find out what knowledge is out there so I can then, and it may be a little bit selfish, I want more knowledge. I'm greedy for that. If I'm greedy for something, it's knowledge.
Yeah.
But it makes me very like,
Just open to
I'm open,
knowing.
but I'm also like, my ego doesn't, I realized early on that if I was holding on to my ego, that I would never get the kind of information that I
That you
wanted.
need.
So I just kind of was like, let my ego go. And I'm the first person to say, I know nothing about this. Can you tell me about it? And people love that, by the way. They love that you're open enough to be like, tell me what you know. right? It shows a great, people think, I think oftentimes they think in social situations, because I do a lot of outreach, you know, if they know everything that they need to know and they can sound smart and everything, that this is the way that people will like them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think if you get in front of a classroom, you need to know what you're talking about. But I think in social situations, people tend to respond to people who are really listening to them and interested in them, right? And that's how I get a large majority of my knowledge. I listen. And so when I walk into collection storage, I listen.
Yeah.
I listen. And if I don't know something, I will think about the object, I will interact with the object, and then I will go and I will do research on the object. But I will say that the Benin bronzes are probably the easiest case study to talk about in the sense that it is the most controversial. So it gives us a lot of information on some of the negotiations that museums are dealing with right now in terms of repatriation. The Benin bronzes are not complicated in the fact that we know that they are violent acquisitions, right? And
so that's an easy one.
that's an easy one. I don't have to defend that, argue that, like put that out. Like there's no arguing that, right? I'm not arguing that at all. What I'm arguing is that they now have a social life that has developed beyond that one moment, right? Just like they had a social life prior to that moment.
Yeah.
I feel that it is an injustice, although I am not negating the fact that we have to constantly be talking about the accountability of the looting. But I feel that it is an injustice to the objects and to the people that created these objects to constantly be speaking to them and referring to them only as loot. And only referring to them about concerning this one moment in time where the Benin Kingdom was, you know, with this action, this 1897 military campaign on Benin, this invasion, it in many ways broke the kingdom down. The entire structure of this kingdom was demolished in that moment. Now it has completely flourished and sort of emerged in a completely, it's still very much the same, but also different based on the pain of this event. But it had real strong and long-term effects on Benin Kingdom and Benin City and the whole entire area.
So would you say, just as a quick follow-up to
Yeah.
that, would you say that our discourse around the loot kind of marvels at the wound and doesn't think about the post and attending to that wound and healing?
Or the pre.
Yeah.
I would say the
Yeah.
pre and the post.
Yeah.
Remember, it's
Yeah.
past and
Yeah.
present.
Yeah.
We're at the crossroads. That
Yeah.
1897, that was the crossroads, right, of this particular issue, right? So what I am concerned about is the continuous centering of whiteness and white like violence in this conversation, right? If you read some of the literature on this, some of the things that journalists have written about it, it's still every single image is of white men surrounded by tusks and helmets and rifles. And so the visual imagery that is being communicated is still of white domination, right?
And violence.
And violence. And there definitely needs to be an accountability, and the journalists that wrote about this and the anthropologists that wrote about these things, their works are very solid, they're very, very valid, and they're very important because it's white accountability and it needs to happen. But it's not the entire story, and it's not my story, and it's not the story that I want to tell as a curator that cares for these objects, these cultural items, these ancestors, if you will, that are living in the space now that I am living in, right? My job is for care, right? So how can I care for them best? Okay, that means I don't ring the bells like crazy when I'm moving them, right? Because those call spirits, right? That means that I have certain kinds of ways in which I deal with the objects so that they're respected and cared for, right? And that comes out of my knowledge and the way in which I keep increasing knowledge about the care of the objects. This comes from communicating with people who are from this culture, Edo people, artists, who are still working and creating art. I will say that when I came, the objects were not ever really being brought out or talked about. It was almost like they were in storage and that was it. And when I came, even though it was controversial, my effort was really to bring them out and to make them accessible, not to display them. I still don't know how I feel about that, about display. But I wanted a conversation to start happening, and I wanted that conversation to involve, in particular, Nigerian students and faculty on campus.
Okay.
And make accessible. In addition to sort of breaking it open, because Harvard can be very, it's Harvard, right? Breaking it open and also incorporating people from the Nigerian community in Boston as well. And then having conversations with people like Inotie Ogbebor, who is very much involved in repatriation connected to the palace and also working with the British Museum. Like people who are middle people, right? I consider myself a walk-in-between person, right? So I think there are many different ways to achieve a specific goal. And I feel like strategy is absolutely important in almost everything that you do. It's all kind of the art of war for me, And I believe that it is not within my power to make a decision about what happens.
Yes.
And I'm okay with that. I really have the power to care more than anything else, right? And in the caring, I feel that, again, it's about a holding environment, that I can create spaces where we're asking important questions about how can we heal this wound, this gaping wound.
Sarah, there's a lot.
It's complicated too, right? Like it goes beyond, because honestly, there are diaspora groups that see the Benin Kingdom in similar ways that the Benin Kingdom may see the British, right? Because the Benin Kingdom were often these middlemen in the transatlantic slave trade and the wealth. So it again, we can't be modernists about this. We can't be like, white people are bad, Black people are great. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know we want to default to that, like, 100% all the time.
But it's more complex than that.
But it's so much more complex than that.
Yeah.
And we have people who really have, in many ways, made decisions that they need to take responsibility for those decisions.
Absolutely. Sarah, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you to stick around for a part 2 to sort of excavate, because there's a lot that you've just mentioned here, and I would love to sort of go a bit deeper as well, just to also get a bit of some of the strategies, because I think not only the Peabody, but a lot of institutions are dealing with similar kinds of questions and problems. And I think complicating what we're dealing with when we're dealing with sacred items is a necessary first step, because the default move is always, these folks are bad, these folks are good, let's stick with the good guys, imprison all the baddies kind of vibe. And I think what you're demonstrating for us today is the importance of thinking beyond that and holding that in very, very serious and important ways. For our viewers, please join us next week for another conversation with Dr. Clunas as we continue a conversation around really caring for and attending to incredibly contested and contentious collections within our various cultural institutions across the globe. I am Siseko Kumalo, your host, and I look forward to seeing you next week.